Welcome everyone to our webinar. We're going to wait just a few seconds and let a few more folks get in to the webinar. So just be a little patient with us, but you are at the right place. If you came to hear Dr. Hale talk about his book, The Choice We Face.
As seen in the slide.
Yeah. So give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we have other folks who will be looking and paying attention and letting folks in. We are very, very excited to present this webinar tonight. Heather and I met Dr. Hale in DC at a national conference, the Network for Public Education, and had an opportunity to hear him talk about his research as a historian. That's a lot of it's been summarized in this book as just one of his scholarly endeavors. And we were so impressed that we asked him to please come and share this with us in North Carolina, as we are absolutely at this point. But Dr. Hale is an associate professor of education policy and education history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research focuses on the history of student activism and the intersection of race and education policy. His research has been published in a number of journals, including The Atlantic, The Education Week, and Journal of Urban History. His books include A New Kind of Youth, Historically Black High Schools, and Southern Student Activism, and the award-winning The Freedom Schools, and the focus of our discussion today, The Choice We Face, How Segregation and Race and Power Have Shaped America's Most Controversial Education Reform Movement. He will be in a conversation tonight with Dr. Heather Coons. Dr. Coons is the Director of Communication at Public Schools First, and she was a high school English teacher before she started working at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and earning her PhD in educational evaluation and measurement from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And then she has worked for many, many years as an education researcher in the private sector. So thank you, Heather, for being here tonight and helping us lead this conversation. For the audience, what we would like to do is we're going to let Jon and Heather have a conversation around this research, and then we are going to save some time for questions and answers at the end. So if you would like to kind of, if you have comments or questions, you want to stick them in the chat, you're welcome to do so, but we will save time at the end for you to have an opportunity to speak and share your thoughts or questions with Dr. Hale. Thank you, Heather, and I'll let you and Dr. Hale get going.
Thanks, Yvonne. And I just want to echo how excited we are to have this conversation with Dr. Hale. It's such a thrill to talk with you today about your book. So I want to just share that I went into reading your book thinking that I knew a little bit about school choice and the vouchers and the history of school choice in the United States and in North Carolina, but I found out really quickly that my knowledge just barely scratched the surface. And it was such a fascinating dive. I just found it riveting. And I'm just going to start at the beginning and share this image, pitch your book. I hope the folks who haven't read it yet get on and read it. And today's conversation will be a good entree into it. But it was fascinating, and I thank you for writing it. So to start us off, I'd just like to ask you to tell us about yourself, a little bit about your background and what brought you to writing this book at the time you chose to write it.
Yeah, thank you. And everyone, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules, busy school year. 2024 is just incredibly important year, and I know how busy everyone is. So thank you for taking the time and also the interest in my book. Heather and Yvonne, thank you so much for the invitation, and just I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to audiences about school choice. I think it's a critically important topic in education policy, but also just the history of the United States, right? That our history as a nation depends on public education, and school choice is really, I think, sort of threatening our foundation. So I think it's an urgent topic that we have to address through conversation, but hopefully through action and obviously changing policy as well. So I appreciate the chance to talk about it. Um, I currently teach at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and I've been here since 2021, I think. Yeah, 2020, 2021. But I spent about a decade in South Carolina, and I moved to South Carolina after defending my dissertation from Illinois. I was working on the history of the Mississippi Freedom Schools. I'd encourage everyone, there's a few freedom schools set up across the state of South Carolina, of course, and North Carolina. North Carolina in Raleigh and Durham have a significant sort of it's a hub in some ways of freedom schools. I encourage everyone to check out the work there. But I was doing historical work and oral histories around those who attended freedom schools and those who taught in freedom schools in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, and really diving into the history of education in the South, but education specifically as a civil rights issue. And that was the work I was doing. That was the mindset I was in. And I came across and just a part of my community engagement, getting to learn who folks were in South Carolina, who was, doing work on the side of justice, who, because South Carolina, like North Carolina, is a tough place to be, right? There's a lot of work to make this an equitable, safe, and loving place for everybody. So I was trying to engage with community members. And this led me to Burke High School, which I talk about in the book. And they're hosting a series of meetings. Burke High School was the last traditional public school, for those of you who've been to Charleston, in the peninsula in downtown Charleston, which struck me, being quite familiar with the history of education, that there's only one traditional public high school left. It was also predominantly Black. It was a historically Black high school, and it remained predominantly Black, 98% African American when I moved to Charleston in 2011. And there was always discussion. There was a narrative of failure around Burke. There's an overemphasis on student discipline and violence, and it was a safe place. But by reading the local newspaper, the Post and Courier, you wouldn't know that. There was an emphasis on the achievement gap, and there were a lot of discussion about closing Burke High School or converting it to a charter school, a magnet school. They had a co-location for a magnet school that had just moved to North Charleston. So there was interest in sort of changing the structure of the last traditional public school in Charleston. And I was interested as not only a scholar interested in the history of education and civil rights, as a community member interested in the last traditional public high school. But also, I was hoping at the time to be a future parent, and I'm going to invest in send my kids to the local public school. So I wanted to be part of the system. And anyways, as part of these discussions at Burke High School about how to improvement, there was more and more chatter, specifically among white parents, about a charter school and what Burke High School would look like as a charter school. And personally, knowing the history, I was alarmed, very alarmed that there were people who were going to take the last high school in Charleston and convert it to a charter school. And in my mind, that was essentially privatizing it without oversight, who was going to make sure that quality was sustained, et cetera. But I was really struck by the lack of what I felt was a lack of understanding about what charter schools meant in the state of South Carolina, specifically in the city of Charleston. I was alarmed about how specifically white parents were talking about it. I felt that they were entitled to sort of make a choice, even though they wouldn't step foot in the building during the school day or send their children there. I was just kind of alarmed about the rhetoric and then the policy proposals to change Burke to a charter school. And at that point, I was involved in various initiatives. One of my good colleagues and friends, Benjamin Hadeen, you should check out his work as well. We were hosting what we called the Charleston Civil Rights Film Fest, and he was visiting in town that year. I think we had Dave Dennis, who was a civil rights activist in Mississippi movement, Danny Glover, who was a friend of Snick, he flew in from California, but we were all in conversation, and it was just, I think I was inspired to write something in the present moment and urgently about school choice, because people I just felt didn't see the history. And I felt like what I could do to reach out to white parents and teachers and to share what this history was could perhaps at least start a conversation about school choice, and how so many people just, loosely use this term without understanding its historical importance, its significance, and how it's actually devastated a lot of communities. So I was really in Charleston, I guess a long story to a question. I was in Charleston, engaged in these conversations about school choice, and I felt something had to be done given my privilege as a scholar in Charleston at the College of Charleston. And I decided there, sort of in that moment in 2011, 2012, to start writing a book about school choice. And then my editor at Beacon Press, Rachel Marks, who's been absolutely incredible. She was really encouraging and sort of proposed the idea. She liked it and encouraged me to write the book. I was actually writing two books at the same time. I won't recommend it. I hope it's not too noticeable. It was a busy schedule of a very understanding partner, um, who allowed me to do that. But I really felt it was urgent to sort of put this book out there as fast as I could. And I'm appreciative of any conversations we can have around it. So that's kind of how I came to the topic and interest in writing a book specifically on choice.
Well, we appreciate that you acted on that sense of urgency and wrote the book, because it's so helpful to have a better understanding of the history and see that lens when we're trying to understand and grapple with what's happening today and in North Carolina and across the nation. But given your expertise, can you talk about the aspects of the history of school choice that help explain this current assault on public education? It feels like there's a new wave of assault, and maybe that's just what we're feeling right now, but there's just a long and very nuanced and layered history. Can you give us a sort of the cliff notes of that to bring us up to date?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I spent about 200 pages probably in
I
the book
know.
about it, but you know, um, school choice in its modern contemporary form, right, really starts in the 1950s with the economist Milton Friedman, who's talking about free market theory, or really, some of the principles of libertarianism, very small government or no government whatsoever, and allowing individuals to choose the schools they want to go to as they would choose in a market, or to make these sort of rational decisions. That idea was picked up in the 1950s, and Milton Friedman first publishes this idea in 1955 called The Role of Government in Education. But Southern segregationists in the former Confederacy and all the states pick up this idea and start talking about, well, we should allow families to choose where they want to go to school. And here's where we developed the first sort of freedom of choice plan. These were blatantly segregationist principles, widely adopted across the South, but the Supreme Court finally struck them down in 1968 and 1969, which is why you begin to see full-scale desegregation in 1970, 1971. Charlotte Mecklenburg is a case in point, because the Supreme Court and the federal courts were working with busing as a way to achieve desegregation. So you had this sort of idea of school choice to maintain segregated schools that the Supreme Court shot down by the 1960s. So that's the first sort of phase, was choice schools, basically private segregation academies, right, to avoid desegregated public schools. Then you have desegregation occur across the South at all levels by the early 1970s. But beginning in the early 1970s, you really have a lot of uncomfortable white parents who are now going or sending their children to desegregated schools, and they want a way out. They want a means to leave the school that they're currently assigned to. So the idea that parents or families should be able to choose where they go to school, constitutionally, this is known freedom of association. You can't tell the government, we have a right as United States citizens not to be told who to associate with. Typically is aligned with religious freedom, right? about where to choose to go to church, et cetera, what organizations we belong in, right? That's typically what it's associated with, but it was applied then to say, you know what, the government shouldn't tell me where to go to school. And just during this period where you get this idea of government schools, you heard Trump talking about a lot, Betsy DeVos, like government schools, public schools, they're forcing you to go to this school. The ideology, right, maintains itself throughout the 1970s. People are leaving public schools, not necessarily for charter schools yet, but they're leaving, they're going to the suburbs, they're going to private schools if they can afford it. They're moving out of cities where public schools are desegregated and where their children will go with children of color. So the ideology sort of sticks around, right? Now, by the time we get to the Nation at Risk report in the 1980s, right? It's released in 1983. Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party really picked this up, and there's a sort of scare. It's another layer of fear or uncertainty we have about public education. So by the 1980s, right, we have a whole history of people wanting to pull out of the public school system. And we sort of lose sight of the freedom of choice plans that the Southern segregationist governors proposed, like freedom of choice plans. But lo and behold, we begin to get a bipartisan coalition, Lamar Alexander, Bill Clinton, George Bush from Texas, right? Then he becomes president, right? Embracing the idea of charter schools. And charter schools, right, really sort of take a lot of the attention. They start attracting Democrats or support from the left. I mean, they appear to be public schools. You know, it connects the idea of magnet schools, the idea of giving choice. So by the 1990s, we start to see choice becoming quite popular across the aisle. Now, with that, right, there's an ideology. We begin devoting federal money to school choice. We also have a Supreme Court decision, Zelman v. Harris in 2004, that allows public dollars to go to private schools in Milwaukee and Cleveland. This is going to be the beginning of the voucher program, or the constitutionality of voucher programs, right? And, you know, over time, people are able to chip away at the public education edifice out of fear, out of a belief that they can't be told where to go to school. And the courts are slowly sort of saying, you know what, this is okay. A charter schools looks like it's public on paper. Or, you know, schools have a right to send money to private schools if it's in a vested interest, et cetera, right? But there's this long sort of divestment from public education beginning in 1954, but that really sets the context for what we're seeing today. People, and that's the point I wanted to bring up in the book, people on both sides of the aisle agreed to school choice. They support charter schools. Listen, we can't forget President Barack Obama, right, supported charter schools. His Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, was a champion of charter schools in the Chicago public school system before he moved to DC to become Secretary of Education. This is part of it too. In North Carolina, I know we're struggling with charter schools after you released the cap, right? Charter schools don't have the oversight, but these were supported by Democrats. So it's not just a Republican far-right extreme issue. It's actually fed its way into both political parties. So it's a real struggle, right? To determine what we're talking about with school choice. And that's why I felt like a history can help explain the assault on public education. It's a long history. In some ways it's convoluted, but it's been it's really been a long history, and so many of us are complicit in it. And we don't see how, right? So I think this historical analysis that I try to sort of build in the book can be used to sort of unpack our own role in school choice and what we mean by it.
Yeah, it's really nuanced and layered there. And can you know, this whole notion of spending public tax dollars for the private good, instead of, you know, you talk in the book about the ideology of public education being the public good, and this notion of school choice focusing just on the individual good, and how, you know, the problems with taking our public dollars away from this public good is really detrimental to our country as a whole, and this notion of public education. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also, I just wanted to, you know, as you're talking about the school choice movement, how has it affected the rights of students and the civil rights? You know, we're coming up on Martin Luther King's birthday on Monday. Can you talk a little bit about the rights that we've lost, in at least in some cases with the school choice movement and the laws that aren't being followed by private schools and things like that?
Yeah, so one, I just want to point out a scholar who really looks at public education as a constitutional right. One, it was a movement of the civil rights movement. So if you look at the work of Dave Dennis and Bob Moses, and may he rest in power, right, talking about quality education as a constitutional right, they talk about a lot. But also the scholar, he's at University of South Carolina Law School, Derek Black, he's a big name at Network for Public Education. I'd strongly encourage you to check out his work. His recent book, Schoolhouse Burning, really talks about this as well. But it's the idea that the United States, as it was developing as a nation, relied on notions of public school to build a democracy. Thomas Jefferson, for all his flaws, talked about and proposed a free public school system in the Notes on the States of Virginia, which was published in the 1780s, right? Other founding fathers picked up this idea. Benjamin Rush, for instance, advocated for the idea of public education. If you look at the Northwest Ordinances of 1785, they talk about each new territory has to establish money for a public school. Like it clearly associated with our nation's first leaders that we needed a public school system because that was foundational for democracy, right? That was a first sort of iteration of this. And then when we finally get public schools in the 1840s in the northern states, they were founded on the principle, they were founded as common schools, common to everybody, funded by common tax dollars. It was an unquestioned principle for the first 200 years of this democracy, or this fledgling democracy, this struggle with democracy, that public education was absolutely not, it was for the most part, unquestioned. We knew we had to have a public education system. Still to this day, United Nations uses an index to measure the quality of a public education system to give a sort of ranking of each country. It's understood within political science that we need a public education. I mean, Plato talked about this you could go back and talk about how people conceptualized a utopia in Plato's case, or a strong representative democracy is dependent upon a public school system. That notion has been with us much longer than school choice. That's why historical analysis is so important. We can't let people tell us that it's all about the individual's right to choose. That's a historic anomaly. We haven't really thought that in this nation for very long, right? And it's hotly contested. That idea, I think, really needs to be challenged. Like, it's the individual. So we've never really agreed to that. We never as a country bought into that. So don't let anyone fool you that that is somehow is as American as apple pie as I talk about. It's not. An American concept is one of actually public education. So there's that idea is out there. But that's one historic point I want to make. The second one I want to make about the public good and public education is when you look at the southern states specifically, segregationist governors and then also enslavers did not want public education in the southern states because if they didn't have a majority of enslaved persons in their counties or states, it was close to a majority. And educating enslaved persons or formerly enslaved persons was highly dangerous to enslavers. That was upsetting the balance of power. So public education was not on the ballot in southern states. But if you read two books, W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction talks about this in detail, and James Anderson's Education of Blacks in the South. I'll also reference Heather Williams from North Carolina. Read and Write Arithmetic will talk about the first movement of Black legislatures elected after the Civil War during Reconstruction. The first political move was to write public education into state constitutions. So if you read North Carolina state constitution and it provides a right to a public education, I don't think it says quality public education. And Yvonne, thanks for sharing the links. I see you sharing the links. Check them out. They'll talk about formerly enslaved and now freed persons changed the Constitution to allow for public education for the first time in the history of these southern states. It is believed that in other words, freedom will be protected, democracy will be protected if we have public education in the Constitution. So arguably, like Derek Black and others argue, to take public money and send it to private schools, including charter schools that are espousing, for instance, Christian nationalist belief, is actually unconstitutional. We're not allowed to do that because it says in all of our state constitutions we need public education. So that is one of the historic tragedies of this moment, is we're actually not paying attention to what our state constitutions say. And people are literally getting away with privatizing public education. So there's a legal movement to sort of recognize that if you look at the Constitution, we have to provide a public education. And all these legislators, right, are not abiding by these constitutions. And in terms of civil rights or the rights of students and honoring Dr. King's, birthday and holiday on Monday, school choice has really chipped away at the rights of individual students, because the rights of students, and let's just look at, for instance, students with disabilities and the rights around IDEA, enshrined in PL 94-142 in 1972. It was a public law as a result of parents suing school districts for rights, but following the blueprint of the Brown decision. So people were looking at the Brown decision and say, you know what, this doesn't just have to be about race. It could be about my children who are being denied a public education because of certain perceived disabilities or ability questions, right? And after the series of court cases, which led to the IDEA Act, provided, or rather recognized, the rights that parents were demanding for their children, their rights to a free and appropriate public education. That right was enshrined after the Brown decision, but it took place in public schools. Public schools were the realm in which the rights of students and parents were decided. We needed that public school space in order to articulate and define these rights. Why? Because there's oversight. There's local, state, and federal oversight to make sure our students and our children are protected in public schools. Once you start to embrace school choice and you allow charter schools and you allow segregation academies and you allow voucher programs, or if you start to look at states like Arizona, and I understand North Carolina has to a lesser degree, but educational savings accounts, you lose that oversight. You lose the opportunity to make sure our children's rights are protected in schools. That's the oversight we lose. And that's one of the greatest dangers, is we sort of lose that oversight, that historic oversight, where we really use the schoolhouse as a way to protect the rights of children. And when you protect the rights of children, you're protecting the rights of a democracy. If you do that, if you do right by the children, you create the conditions for a thriving democracy. And when you chip away at that, you're chipping away at the whole democratic project.
I can share that in North Carolina, our voucher program is growing by leaps and bounds with the recent legislation just over the years, and since it was instituted. And that they don't have any protections there either. There's just rampant discrimination. It's a huge problem, particularly religious discrimination, but LGBTQ, students with disabilities. It's really bad in North Carolina, for sure. And I also, before, to prepare for our conversation, I did go to our Constitution, so I can quote that the North Carolina Constitution is exactly what you're talking about. And it states inside, there's a constitutional mandate to provide by taxation a general and uniform system of free public schools wherein equal opportunities shall be provided for all students. So it says a general and uniform system of free public schools. And we've really veered quite off of that uniform system of public schools when we have these different schools that are allowed to accept different students, provide transportation, not provide transportation, lots of different barriers that are existing now for students in charter schools and the private schools that accept vouchers.
Yeah. And even, I don't know if we'll get to it too, but in North Carolina, it's so interesting because the case of Charlotte and Mecklenburg, right?
Yeah.
In schools. And there's a really good book, Color and Character by Pamela Grundy. I don't know if your organization has read it, or, really talks about Charlotte Mecklenburg demonstrated what a desegregated school could really do, right? Test scores went up, social attitudes and relationships grew. We saw the sort of qualitative factors that you can't measure in a standardized test: empathy, compassion, understanding between, right? people of different racial and cultural backgrounds occur in a public school. In the early 2000s, when they overturned, or they said, okay, this is unified enough, what do you see within 5 years? Resegregation, the growth of charter schools, right? Transportation becomes a major issue. So we see what happens when you divest from the idea of a quality public education for the public good. North Carolina is a telling cautionary tale of what's going to happen when we fully back away from that, right? Individuals, I would argue, can't always be trusted if they're only focused on the individual. So, and I think you see that happening in North Carolina now too.
Yeah, it's a sad case, certainly, and you could certainly can't ignore the fact that race has a lot to do with it. It's a huge factor in what's been happening. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how this school choice is? It seems like it's becoming dominated by big businesses and the billionaire class and millionaires. And you talk about this in your book, and mostly white billionaires and millionaires are pushing and funding these foundations and these organizations. And what are the implications for the communities, and how can we just gather together and fight back against these massive dollars being thrown at voucher programs and the support for those and charters?
It's so hard because there's so much money invested in this, right? It's hard to find. And then we look at even prior to the latest iteration of the culture wars that we're seeing, anti-critical race theory, anti-LGBTQIA plus, school board elections were already getting expensive. It was actually quite expensive in a lot of locations to run for school board. I'm not quite sure what the specifics are like in North Carolina, but I know in Charleston County, it was tens of thousands of dollars to run for a local school board by the time I left Charleston. And that, to a local person who just, maybe a parent working full-time, two job, that's a commitment that a lot of people don't have who go to public school. So just their locally contested elections are it's just expensive to sort of fight for what you believe in. Is increasingly expensive today in public education, unfortunately. But Dr. Coons, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? It's wealth. It's an elite that are sort of driving this school choice movement and ideology. To be fair, it's not as in what's difficult in sort of, I think, writing the book and discussing it today. It's a different sort of brand of racism. Beverly Cross calls it new racism. Some would call it color evasive racism. It perpetuates the same segregation impulse, I think, unknowingly. And you see this in the philanthropic organizations of the Walton Foundation's huge, right? The Broad Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they're funding Teach for America. They're chipping away at public teacher education programs. They're funding school choice and vouchers. Charter schools are sponsoring charter schools. This is a movement of venture philanthropy where they're looking to sort of sustain their organizations through funding, but it's also the branch or the arm of a movement of capitalism that our schools should be run like a business. We should have a bottom line. Profit will drive. It's the ideas of Milton Friedman coming back. But when you ignore the race, class, ability, and of course now we're seeing a lot of harrowing topics or harrowing experiences around sexuality in schools today. When you start to fund schools or fund an idea through grants like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for instance, when you start to fund ideas that don't take into account these factors, you just perpetuate the problem. If you're proposing charter schools and don't really pay attention to race or ability or sexuality, you're perpetuating the problem because these issues need to be addressed. One, so you have a bunch of venture capitalists and philanthropists, right? Say, well, we want to great. It sounds like great intentions, right? But they're actually avoiding the problem, which just makes it worse in this country, right? So they're not even dealing with the issues that we were supposed to deal with in 1954, and we just haven't really grappled with these issues yet, and we still evade these issues. Was one issue with the philanthropists too. The other idea is, for just throughout the history of education, why do we keep allowing business owners to run a school. They don't have a degree in education. They haven't taught. A lot of their children haven't gone to public schools, but yet they're making decisions. It's the same thing. We saw this with um, the Hampton and Tuskegee models with Booker T. Washington. We saw business owner, and this is what Dr. Anderson talks about in Education of Blacks in the South. We have a very much a business community coming in to intervene to tell Southerners how to run their public schools, or to tell Black community organizers how to run their schools, as if they know best, as if these white business owners know best. It's the same thing, just in a sort of a modern form, right? It's this old notion in education. We don't allow this in our courts. We don't allow it, thank God, in our hospitals. We're allowing people who aren't experts in pedagogy or education tell us what to do with money, right? And this is happening. So that's also just a perennial problem that we're seeing time and time again, is business interests coming in. So the impact, what impact US does this have on local communities? And I'll go back to Charleston to sort of help illustrate this. Black and brown communities are devastated oftentimes when school choice arrangements come into play in local communities, because if you set up a magnet school or a charter school in North Charleston, you can look at North Charleston, they have academic magnet high school. In Charleston, they have various math and charter schools and neighborhoods. What oftentimes happen is a school, and then this goes to your real estate apps. One of the first things that come up that determine the value of your home is its proximity to a good public school or magnet school or charter school. Once a school starts to increase ranking, right, home values start to go up. So eventually, what I'm trying to say is it leads to displacement. If a public school was in a area that's now, let's say, a charter school, but it was an area that was predominantly Black or brown, and test scores start to go up, white people start to want to send their kids, or rather families with money want to send their kids there, they start to move into the neighborhood. There's massive displacement. There's also this idea about equal opportunity for all. So, it's not just the local kids who live here. We have to allow white children who live in the suburbs to come downtown if they want to, because that's going to lead to or integration. It leads to displacement. So there's a real impact on community wealth through real estate around these sort of these choice districts that are experimenting with charters and magnets. A lot of times you see people moving back, and this was happening in Charleston. And I'll also say, to point again to the work of, Josh Cowan, but then also Derek Black. If you look at what happened in Ohio, a lot of these charter schools are run by, they're supposed to be nonprofit, but their boards can engage and work with subsidiary companies that actually make money. So the board may be nonprofit, but it could be engaging with people who are making money through whatever services you're chartering or whatever value goes up in your neighborhood. They are profiting off of that indirectly. So communities are losing twice, not only in displacement, but they're not being engaged in increasing the wealth of that community. They're being displaced and allowing other businesses, outside businesses, to come in and sort of profit off of that.
Yeah, and we've seen that in North Carolina too. There in the news recently, actually, there's been some cases where there's been a misappropriation of hundreds of thousands of dollars that went to charter schools. And in the voucher program, schools claiming that they have students when in fact they don't actually have those students. And so we're losing tax dollars to fraudulent entities.
Yeah,
certainly.
Because you lose that layer of oversight that we're talking about earlier, right? It's unchecked, and oftentimes it's reported later. In South Carolina, there was a charter school, Meminger Elementary, which was run by Ben Navarro. You should look him up. He's now influencing statewide policy in South Carolina, but he was running a community arm of a debt collection agency in Maryland, in Delaware, ended up in Charleston, opened up a school.
Wow.
But not what was going on in the school was not open to public record. 2 years after they first opened, we found that they were suspending or expelling over 50% of kindergarteners in the school. So we saw but this was happening. The public didn't know about it until we, requested through FOIA public information. But that's what it takes, right? These schools are unaccountable because of this idea, let the market determine the value.
Yeah.
The market.
Yeah. And reporters can't necessarily keep up with all of these cases. And in North Carolina, our voucher program has no accountability. We don't have accountability for student achievement. it's like it's the Wild West. But as you talk about in your book, where there is some accountability, and we can see how students perform academically when they move to a charter, oftentimes it doesn't look good at all, and they perform worse. Josh Cowan talks a lot about this. So the whole notion of these choices being better for students' academic achievement is a false narrative in many cases, and it's very harmful for students in a number as well.
Yeah, in the Credo reports, if you look at Credo, they release it, they're based out of Stanford, and they release it.
Yeah, right.
I think one of the most positive reports had 35% of charter school students doing better than, but that's 35%. That's not a major victory, right? What about the 65%
The
who,
65% that don't, and
yeah,
the amount that they did was it was negligible, and people who criticized that report pointed out that they're claiming a benefit when it's really statistically, it's not really much of a benefit. And I know the NPE folks put out a pretty strong critique of the claims in that report.
yeah.
But yeah, it's the whole narrative around not accepting that the public schools are actually doing quite well
And
in comparison.
a lot of these charters too, John Oliver has a really funny clip. It's funny, but it's tragically sad.
Yeah.
These charter schools can close on a without any notice. So what do?
Mm-hmm.
You don't, in those reports, in those quantitative reports, you don't see the stories and the lived experiences of families who agree to go to a charter school and they close their doors and say, okay, good luck, go back to your regular public school, or good luck finding a school on short notice, right? That's devastating. You try to break down the success to these quantitative numbers that doesn't tell the lived experiences of that 65% who have not been served by charter schools or who had attended a school that was closed on short notice, right? Those stories and those voices are not captured in these quantitative reports that arguably actually don't live up to what they're claiming.
Right. Right. And the students often go back to public schools,
They have,
which if we supported public schools well, they wouldn't ever feel like they would want to leave in the first place. And that's, so supporting the public schools and making sure that they're well funded, teachers are well served.
yeah.
So in your book, if shifting gears a little bit to another question I have here, in your book, you talk about the various ways people talk about choice, school choice. So in North Carolina, we have some controlled choice programs, like in Wake County, for example, where it's the largest school district in North Carolina. We have magnet programs, that we have controlled choice. People talk about that, and then other kinds of choice. Can you describe them and what you have learned in your research and just talking with all the people that you talk about nationally? What have you learned about the most effective language or messaging that we can use supporting public schools and choice within a truly public school system? Not public, charters are often talked about as public, but they're not really public when you think about accepting all students and providing for all students, even in North Carolina, that it doesn't happen in a lot of cases. So,
And you see people actually, you see that, I mean, charters used to be the sort of vanguard of school choice, but I think you see vouchers and ESAs because they have the legal permission now to fund vouchers like they never have before. They're not checked, right? So I think a lot of choice people are looking at vouchers and ESAs as a way to go, and charter schools now aren't sort of private enough. So you can see the true intentions that people had with charter schools.
Right. And in North Carolina, we are opening up the voucher program. So there's no longer income eligibility, and you don't have to have gone to a public school, which we used to have in North Carolina. And we have, for example, a segregation academy that wasn't doing very well. It was a private school, was losing enrollment. So it shifted to be a charter school to keep it alive.
Yeah.
Right now. So now I wonder, is it going to become a private school again and use vouchers? Because there's less accountability with private schools using vouchers. It'll be interesting to see.
In the cases coming out of Oklahoma where the court is considering how public funds can be used for explicitly Christian schools, right, we'll be telling as well. And that's where Derek and Dr. Preston Green are really good at sort of looking at what these cases are, because we're about to hear more on that as well. But it looks like it's just gonna become blatantly private soon too. In terms of, so you asked about the sort of language, like what's effective.
Effective language, and people talk about, they have different ideas of what they mean when they say school choice. So we have public school choice, and then there are other people who are and then private choice outside of the public system, and then different reasons people have for choosing to move out if this public system isn't serving them well, for example. But just language around, the various ways people talk about choice, and what you have seen has been effective in supporting public schools and choice within a public school system.
Yeah, gosh, I mean, it's in even Champaign where I live, they have a controlled choice. And in a lot of my well debates, I'll put that in quotes, debates with libertarians, they'll say it controlled choice isn't school choice because it's still controlled by
Mm,
it's not enough of an individual initiative or private initiative that's
there's
not.
restrictions around it.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
restrictions and it's still controlled by, the
Yeah.
big bad government and all that. So, but yet they still use choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that language. And also, if you look at the rhetoric that we saw from President Obama and Arnie Duncan, school choice is a civil right. It's the same phrase that Donald Trump and DeVos would use, school choice is a civil right. So we're using the same rhetoric, but coming from very different places. So there's a lot to unpack around that. I think, there's been a recent move, I think NPE, Josh, even Sarah Carpenter, who's an activist in Memphis, who work you should check out, talking about schools choice as a way to sort of emphasize, the schools are actually making the choice. It's not really your
Mm-hmm.
choice. The schools are, because if they don't want to educate, yeah, or school choose, yeah, schools are choosing, right? They don't want you, they're not to emphasize, I think that it's sort of a bankrupt, well, there's plenty of money in it, I should say. It's really doing,
False.
yeah, it's a false narrative, right? This it's
Mm-hmm.
not your choice because there's no guarantee that you're actually going to get into that school. I think that's been effective in sort of turning it around. Um, but as I try to talk about in the book, every location, even different neighborhoods within the same city are going to have a different solution. And here, looking at North Carolina, Reverend William Barber, I think, really talks about, I mean, a moral movement, but I also read into that coalition building.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really until we can sort of build these relationships, trusting relationships, and understanding why people want to choose schools, right? You can start to see sort of solutions emerge from that. So it's hard to say what that rhetoric will look like or what language will be espoused as we're talking through these coalition building strategies. But I really do think it starts with um, coalition building. Prior to the pandemic, I think we saw, and I know North Carolina had a touch of this as well, but the Red for Ed movement, I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a lot of potential about raising questions about, well, where's this public funding going? Why have we never restored money to public schools after the austerity cuts, right? During the first recession in the early
Right.
2000s that really shaped sort of public discourse. But that was in part coalition building. It was building relationships around political values, right? That we really haven't seen in a lot of red states before. And I think that coalition building, working with those, in South Carolina, we had school improvement councils. The idea that community members who are invested in the public school will help make some decisions about that school. So I think it's also empowerment within public schools. Public schools do have something to learn from this privatization movement. They haven't been serving communities well. It's such a hard sell to say, oh, go to your public school. Well, there's a lot of distrust there. So it's not as if public schools, they should look at this as an opportunity to improve and work more with parents who are invested in their schools. As hard as that is, right? There needs to be changes as there too. So I think, I really like the idea of coalition building around this notion of a public good. I think we'll see a lot of solutions there as well. Because if you're talking about
Yeah.
public schools, that connects to healthcare, that talks about, protecting the health and well-being of our children. There's so many issues that come through coalition building. That's a lot of, I think, where justice-centered movements start is with coalitions. not philanthropists who have
Yeah.
dollars in one idea. You know, it's coming a bottom-up coalition.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think in your book you talk about single rocks hitting against the big mammoth of the huge funders, these billions of dollars. Single rocks aren't going to do it, but if we gather together, we can really be a force to push against that privatization and that big money
Yeah.
wave that's been coming through.
Yeah.
So
I mean, when
thanks.
people are organized at the local level, it's a sight to behold. I mean, when I was in Charleston, we were able, or the community was able to sort of defeat 3 separate charter school proposals, even though they had financial backing, and it's still a traditional public school. So I mean, the community can speak up.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
that's a hopeful message for us because
yeah, speaking
we
truth
have,
to power. It
yeah,
can,
yeah.
yeah.
So I want to open it up to, we're sort of coming up, let me see, to folks to ask questions. Can you share? Here we go.
Okay, so are you going to stop the sharing? Okay, so one of the things that, one of the questions that someone sent to me was that, you know, they feel pretty defeated right now. Like, how do you communicate to so many people who don't have children in school the value of why this should matter to them? I'm sure you've given that some thought, John.
Yeah, and it's such a hard sell too, because a lot of people have been burned by public education, right? You know, there has been disservice done, so it's hard, but I think it's important to remind, that's why I fall back on historical analysis, because public education has been seen as the foundation of our democracy since the founding of the United States, right? Even, you know, people we revere as the founding fathers believed in public education. You know, it was almost an unquestioned sentiment that we needed public schools if we wanted our democracy to survive. And I think reminding people of that sentiment can have an impact, right? Or just, you know, providing a historical correction to so much misinformation or disinformation today, that we spent a longer period of time in this country investing in the idea of public education than we have in sort of trying to privatize it, because private schools weren't working. We couldn't, it was hard to support a private school district. We really needed public schools. And that was the historical trajectory of this country right up until 1954. So I think sort of reminding people of that analysis, that public education was a founding belief of this nation. And you can, you know, I've pointed to a few sources that sort of track that historically, but also legally, and then constitutionally. It's actually in our state constitutions that is in fact a law. We need public schools. It says so in our state constitution. Every state constitution has a clause for public education. Like that's our historic commitment, and we're turning our backs on that, right? And also the idea, I think, reminding people, or you know, asking people, whose children do they have in mind? You know, why is, you know, the children in maybe your immediate household or in your immediate neighborhood, why do they deserve a chance and children across in a different neighborhood don't, or a different part of the state don't? Are we not responsible for all children? Like, what is the moral imperative to only think about a specific group of children? So whose children are we talking about? You know, that I think we've lost. Sometimes it appears, and this is anecdotal, of course, we lose sight, I think, that what's best for children across the street, across the railroad tracks, across the state, wherever, what's best for them is actually going to be best for my children too. So it's sort of, we have to remind that we're in this together. And I don't know where we got the idea that the individual's a way out, but we're in this sinking ship together, and we better figure it out, because that's kind of what it comes down in my mind, right? It's not just our children, it's our children, it's a collective. You know, there's that, now I hear it more and more, but the phrase the East African greeting, and how are the children, right? We can't answer that country ethically in the United States. They're not doing very well. What, nearly 25% of our children, I'm looking at Children Defense Fund stats, are living in poverty. We helped chip that away during COVID, actually. And now it's back up. But how are the children, right? I think we can answer that ethically if we have a strong public school system. We know they're taken care of, or they can be taken care of well in a strong, thriving public school system. I don't know how much credence that will have, but those are the principles I try to go by when having conversations about choice and the importance of public education.
Well,
Yeah.
John, I really appreciate that because that's one of the things that we struggle with every day, right, Heather? We're trying to like shift the conversation towards let's strengthen, support, improve our
Right.
public schools, right, instead of providing a way out. And what's ironic to me, as someone who's been around a very long time, 4 decades of my life being devoted to being a child and public education advocate, is that we used to be told all the time when we underfunded our schools that, oh, we're just throwing money at it. Okay, we don't, the education advocates would say we need funding for these things, and the opponents of that would say, oh, you're just wanting to throw money at it. Well, right now I see them throwing money out the window. They're throwing money at a way out instead and at millions and millions. And as Heather is documented in several reports she's done in North Carolina, 5 billion by the end of 10 years from now, out the window, instead of investing in paying teachers what they're worth and in funding schools, fully funding schools to provide the education they need. So any comments or thoughts about how we can improve what we're trying to do here, or any thoughts you have about how we show that to the public?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of good quantitative research coming out now. So this is, 2 decades after Katrina, New Orleans, now known as Charter School City. A lot of research that shows that vouchers and charters just aren't working to what they anticipated. You had 20 years to try this experiment. What do you have to show for it? Not much, right? So I mean, there's evidence, and if people want to look at test scores, the test scores there prove it. The voucher test scores prove that they are not academically superior by any means, and arguably in a lot of cases, as Josh has pointed out, worse off, right, with vouchers. So I mean,
Worse
there's
than COVID.
yeah, worse than COVID. It's an
Yeah.
unmitigated disaster when you couple COVID with, right, vouchers and privatization. You just see it's an unmitigated disaster. And New Orleans is a case in point. You're starting to see a lot of research coming out of Memphis about what choice has led. In Memphis, you have the situation, even when people were provided charters and the idea for school choice, they actually created their own separate school district in Shelby County. They moved out of the city of Memphis and created, there's a website, I forgot it. I have it somewhere, but they actually map the number of school districts across the country that sort of seceded from the school district to create their own. It just proves that people want to sort of be in their private island. So, I mean, there's a lot of, you can look at research to show it's to fund a private individual's movement without care for the public good. But then also people want to talk about test scores. If you can find people who want to talk about it, the research shows that there's not a quantitative improvement in test scores either, right? That those cities are providing us evidence that, at least to give us pause. I don't know why we're not looking at those numbers to show, you may have your issues with public education, but there are major issues coming up in research in these cities that have just converted to all charter or are really embracing charter. I mean, Arizona's going to go bankrupt soon if you look at how they're funding their ESAs, right? I mean, the millions, I mean, it's a disaster. Talk about throwing money, to your point, right? Arizona has thrown money at it, and we're not seeing the improvements that people claim. So I
Yeah.
do think there's evidence coming out quantitatively proving that it's not working very well.
And we've also seen how there are communities now where they have had to close their schools because the enrollment dropped to the point where they have to merge schools together, close 4 to keep 5 open, things like that. And then, of course, because charter schools have moved in, for example, and now some of these charter schools are no longer interested. The market's not as lucrative, and they're starting to pull out. And guess what? There's no more public buildings, right? There's no local tax rate in small rural communities doesn't support going out and building another school tomorrow. And so now we're finding that, these children in that community are being abandoned. They're being
Yeah.
abandoned by the charter school industry, and they're going to be left in an environment where funding is going to be hard to get and facilities even impossible in some cases. And we've seen that happen already in North Carolina in a couple rural areas and a couple urban areas.
And
Um,
in terms of,
Charlotte has closed 10 schools downtown.
yeah, no, it's if you, and especially in terms of the rural question, if you follow and read the work of Jess Piper, she's doing really good things in Missouri, but she really champions the implications of school choice in rural counties that charters and the philanthropists aren't talking about building charter schools or voucher programs in rural United States. They're very specific where they want to go, but it's rural folks who also support this idea. They're electing representatives who support school choice, but that is taking away money from rural districts, right?
Mhm.
It's actually not in their best interest. So I mean, there's the rural question, right? Is huge because charters aren't really interested. That's not profitable to go in the country in the United States and build charter schools. That's not what they're talking about. It's not charters or choice for everybody. They're quite specific that it's, for those who have the money to do it or the means to move there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just reducing the funds that are going to those public schools.
Yeah.
And yeah,
And the
yeah.
idea about money being thrown at it, you hear that all the time. I had to sit through the Molly Spearman, the superintendent, she was superintendent in South Carolina, who actually said in a room full at the University of South Carolina, a packed room, she said, we're spending enough money on public education, which got, I don't want to reiterate the response that received. She said not only were they receiving, and they're not in South Carolina, not only do they have enough money, but administrators, I hear a common false narrative, aren't spending it wisely. They're not making the right choices. But after the Red for Ed movement, if you're really going to ask a teacher if more money doesn't make a difference, or if you ask children in these schools, more money does make a difference, makes a big difference, a significant pedagogical instructional difference in all of these children's and teachers' lives. So it's just, we throw out these false narratives without listening to what people are actually saying. We need more money, and teachers and students will tell you exactly what they need and where that money will go. So people who are saying that aren't actually, I think, experiencing the lack of funding in a lot of these public schools.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to give one more chance if anybody wants to unmute themselves or ask a question or pose a question. Kind of here's your last chance here. So feel free to chime in, Suzanne.
Please do.
Yeah, I had a quick question. And I'll be very upfront. As a family of magnet students who have chosen magnet for integration and desegregation, I'm really curious if you could say more about the equating of magnets and charters together, because in my mind they're very different and have very different purposes, and that may be because of the way Wake County runs theirs. But I'm just curious. I do a lot of explaining of the differences in those two and why one is good and one is bad, and so I'm always curious when I hear something different. I'm like, oh, what do I not see? What do I not understand?
Yeah. And something to it, parents who choose one, I personally won't, and I hope I don't convey that through the book or others, like parents who make the choice and they love their children, they're making the best choice they possibly can in the environment. And if there's choices, people are going to make those choices. So that's no one's at fault for it too. I think it's asking questions like you are, like, what is the difference between the two? They're very different. They're both part of the choice model, but magnet schools develop in the mid 1960s as a way to sort of desegregate school systems without having to bus or without having, it was a sort of a less controversial way to desegregate schools. If you could attract people like a magnet back to a school. So let's offer a robust curriculum in math and science or technology or music or art or something to attract people back. And those schools are phenomenal. They're absolutely phenomenal. In fact, there's waiting lists to get into them, and they're public, right? They're subject to oversight. They have, publicly, or they have teachers who are certified by the state, right? I mean, these are legit public schools. They're part of choice because they go beyond the traditional neighborhood boundaries. They want to attract people back. So people from outside traditional boundaries are coming to magnet schools. I think the issue comes in not on the parents who are choosing to go there who get in, because again, they're just looking out for their children, right? It's why aren't we holding school districts accountable? When we find out what works in a magnet school, why are we not going to the public school system and saying, this is working? This curriculum is working. This type of teacher is working. This class size is working, right? That is where I think the ideas fall short. And that is I think that's on district officials and legislators not to fund public schools adequately. It's like the first idea of charter schools, right? I wrote about this, well, in the book, and I have a piece somewhere, some editorial somewhere. Al Shanker and the teacher unions, specifically in Minnesota, supported the charter school idea because the original idea was to open a charter school for 5 years, run by and for teachers with community input, and then they'd shut down the charter school and then go back to the public schools with what they've learned. We have lost that sense of accountability, that we can have these controlled experiments, but it better go back to the public good. And we're not doing that. So charters, that's not even in the equation to do that. Magnet schools have a historic, I think, mission to do that, but I don't know why we're not doing that. I know why, because it costs too much money. We don't want to trust teachers. We just divested from public education, but magnet schools do give us the living research and the lived experience to show what works. It's just on us because we haven't gone back to the public school and to the public school system with that information about how to properly run and sustain a great school. Suzanne, I don't know if that helps or not, but kind of, they're very different. I have a book.
Yeah,
Yep.
it does. I think the question I was having, it sounded like there was a connection also to gentrification, perhaps, or the changing demographics that it was causing.
Yep.
And I guess that was the part I wasn't sure about.
So that's the other thing too. You're right. So I'll go back to Charleston. Is where I started writing a lot of the book. The magnet school in Charleston started in Burke High School to get more white families in the school. It was co-location. They had a separate entrance to the school. They had uniforms. They had a separate lunch hour. They had a separate playground. Those students were separate. They weren't really trying to integrate that school. And eventually it became so popular, they just moved to a different location, to a different city altogether, right? So they had an opportunity to really desegregate a school and they didn't. But what happened is people, and I specifically mentioned lawyers' names, in the 90s and early 2000s, those who are eventually going to lead the cause against affirmative action say, we should not have desegregation quotas or mandates or expectations because that is racist. We can't say, oh, 40% of the school should be African-American, 30% should be Latino, Latina, or Hispanic, and 30% white. They say, we can't do that. It should be equal regardless of race. Well, what happens there's an application process to a magnet school. There's a knowledge base and system that privileges a particular class and race of people and not others. So magnet schools, once the Supreme Court starts to decide that race shouldn't be used as a factor, all of a sudden magnet schools are just for white people. Not in every single case, but that is a lot. So that's where it leads to gentrification, is without the support or buy-in of a government to say integration is important. We have to recognize that not everybody's treated equally until they step in and say, no, magnet schools should be for historically marginalized community, everybody, but we should make sure that there's a percentage in that school. But we can't do that these days. That's where magnet schools can lead.
I'll say Wake actually is doing that. And so I guess that's why I'm confused with the conversation, because what you're describing is what I think Wake is doing really well at, as compared to other places.
Yeah, we can't use race, but we use other measures of that mimic
income and test scores and things like that to provide some diversity across the district. So they have moved to other measures. I also wanted to add that in Wake County, certainly, and I think in other places in North Carolina, the school within a school magnet model is not what is implemented. It's the more whole school magnets. So you'll have a magnet like an arts magnet or a technology or leadership, for example, based on Stephen Covey's work and stuff like that. And the whole school is using that curriculum.
Attached to the theme. So
And every-
I'm
Yeah.
gonna
So
switch
it's a little
over.
different.
We have a couple more people and I think we're gonna run out of time here. Michael, you have your hand up. A wonderful superintendent.
Hey,
You're
Michael.
muted. I hate to say that out loud, that word, those 2 words, 3 words.
Dr. Hale, thank you. I've enjoyed the messages and I've taken a lot of notes. You made reference to several presidents and at least one Secretary of Education. And I concur with you on your observations about them. But I'm curious as to what you might think about the current president and the current Secretary of Education in terms of advocating for this historical support for public schools, and particularly the Secretary of Education, because I haven't heard him express a theory or philosophy of public good with public schools in the sense of democracy, as I've heard President Biden express the need for a reemphasis on democracy versus meritocracy. Do you have any thoughts or insights or whatever on that?
I mean, besides honestly disappointment, because I think there's been silence around the issue. I also think that they're putting out fires where we're not. Conversations like this, I think, are somewhat privileged conversations because we're taking the space and time to do it. I don't know if Secretary Cardoza has that. There's other things going on, but I think education has fallen for whatever reasons. It's not on at least the executive branch's sort of agenda right now. I haven't seen much on it. And I also see sort of President Biden maintaining what his Democratic predecessor maintained, which was kind of a experimental with choice, but through public charters, right? But trying to create more choice. It would both, I think, support the notion of giving more choice to improve the outcomes for families to choose, right? That they would.
Excuse me, I agree. I want to add in North Carolina now for all the people on the call. I shared with the most prominent Democratic candidate for governor in the next election earlier this week that I'd like to hear him speak more forcefully and clearly about his vision for public education, because he's not doing that. And I did say to him, but I recognize that you can't afford to lose voters who support vouchers, private schools, charter schools, and anything else other than traditional, what I call traditional public schools. So how do we help President Biden and a potential governor in North Carolina have the courage to do that? And I heard you get at some of that earlier about talking about helping people without children in schools understand the value of the traditional public schools.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a historic mission. I think there's the collective buy-in to like we're here to help support all children, not just a segment or our own children or others. Like this is collective, but that's pretty much quickly branded as socialism. And I think even politicians at a national stage start talking about public schools. I mean, this pretty soon, I think we're start to see, public education. Those are government schools, or we're redistributing the wealth. It's a tough sell in a divided nation. So I actually surprisingly think it takes political courage and will to actually speak up in defense of traditional public schools, because so many Democrats, right, are also in support of choice. So it's hard to sort of speak it, I think, and still gain votes to talk about it today. I think the climate has shifted that much. And also talk about the Secretary of Ed. I mean, since they were elected into office, these culture wars have been so fierce. I mean, I haven't seen if I'm sure in North Carolina you had some of them too, but what I'm observing, these school board meetings, these used to be the sleepiest places in the United States. Now there's people shouting and cursing and people getting arrested, and they're very volatile, violent spaces, right? And I think the local school board, right, used to be sort of represent what the United States is, and if it still is, we're headed to dark places. So I can understand the hesitancy of a moderate president and Secretary of Education who's just trying to sort of either get reelected. You're not going to be pushing what is now probably more radical, a traditional defense of public schools. Ironically, that's more radical, right? To defend that as opposed to sort of individual initiative. So yeah, I think they're sort of stuck. And what can they say if they want to be reelected? Also, at the same time, these school board meetings, I think, are really illustrating that the struggles at the local level, right? It's in the school board meetings. You remember Steve Bannon, the old strategist? There was a quote, it really scared me. In Virginia, in June of 2020, do you remember that? It was the first sort of school board meeting that blew up. A couple of people were arrested. It started over the use of pronouns. There was a bunch of people in red hats showed up, and they ended up arresting a couple parents, but it quickly turned into denouncing critical race theory. It was in Loudoun County, Virginia.
Hmm.
And it was a first of a lot of sort of a string of these sort of violent school board meetings. But Steve Bannon was there, and he said, this is the battleground for the presidential election. Here's where you're going to find supporters for the Republican Party. Here's where, use the term quote unquote soccer moms. Here's where people are fighting. And he was right. I mean, that was the organizing ground at the local level. So I feel local school boards, Moms for Liberty, banning books, anti-pronouns, anti-CRT, that is driving the agenda. So I think when the president wants to speak on it, that perhaps is how education is being defined, at least in my anecdotal and humble interpretation is, those issues are defined in it. And we're starting, vouchers is just one other part of the ongoing culture war. And I don't want to sound too pessimistic or just, coalition building can get us out of that, but I just feel that's what they're up against.
I want to make one positive comment about the current administration in that they have tightened up, or they're proposing rules to tighten up the charter school programs, the federally funded charter school programs, to limit the for-profit nature. So private entities would not be able to get the grants and things like that. So they are starting to, curtail some of this massive for-profit charter growth, which I see as a really important first and not hopefully only step in scaling back that massive waste.
And also I noticed the shift when NP picked, Diane Ravitch talked about this too. I think you notice the strong advocates of charter schools. I think you're seeing a now stronger push for vouchers in ESAs. It's like they keep pushing it further.
Pushing the envelope, yeah.
Charter schools are being defined closer to the public good or public schools, and now you actually think you're seeing less interest, which is, when I started writing Choice, I never thought I would see that. Such a rise in vouchers and education savings accounts. But we are, and now charter schools almost appear moderate, that they're not the cutting
But they're
edge.
not.
Yeah.
Well, let me see, let me make sure before we start wrapping this up, that we, that I don't see anyone else. So let's do that. I do want to put in there, that's one of the, I told Jon that I read his book and I could just turn to every single page and ask the question, read a sentence from there and ask him to speak of it. It was such a powerful book. And this is one of the sentences in this book towards the very end, the last page. There's, to abandon it now only facilitates its demise. And that's certainly, but go back again, Heather, to that quote, I want to just, okay, the next sentence is re-engaging with public schools, enrolling children in public schools and working to improve traditional public schools will ultimately reframe the debate. And I'll let you read the rest of that yourself. But I love, this is how Jon ends his book, with this paragraph and then the last sentence on the next slide, which is, the fight will not be for my children, but for our children. The choice is ours to make. And so, Jon, as we think about that, what are the things that, you know, what are the 3 or 4 things, what are the kind of ending thoughts you'd like to say about what you'd like people to be able to talk about when they leave here, and what can we, you know, do, you know, organizing, not giving up. But I'll let you kind of wrap us up here with your final thoughts.
Yes, and thank you for the question and sharing the quote. And it's funny because I'll speak to those points, forgetting knows how I concluded the book, right? But I really feel strongly
You want me to put it back? Yeah.
about the public good, which I think almost sounds conservative in a lot of ways, but I mean that it really is. I mean, we're in this together. And I think to remind people that is our constitutional obligation. You can read any state constitution and it's there. I think one, just remind people of that historic commitment that we had as a nation, and people willing to charge the Capitol will talk about how great this country used to be. Well, when they're talking about that time era, just look at it. Public education was front and center. That defined their America, but yet we're still abandoned. So pointing out that historic commitment. I'd also challenge, you know, everyone in every organization, specifically white parents, I think, just to constantly reevaluate, you know, why are we committed to this? And also, why, when we meet people of color, Black or brown advocates for, let's say, charter schools or vouchers, what, to ask questions about why. And when building coalitions, I think we have to look across racial and class lines and to ask the tough questions to see who we are. What is it that makes me unsettled about, you know, there's a different racial history, as I talk about in the book. Black advocates, for instance, for charter schools see it as a freedom struggle, but when Bill Gates talks about it as freedom, it's very different. So I think it's challenging us to really dig down and ask, how is race front and center, and how are we as white parents, teachers, or advocates? What is our relationship to that? Are we an ally? Are we an advocate? Are we telling people what to think? Like, really, I think coalition, but we have to ask those tough questions about race and class, and just kind of either remind ourselves why we're in this or what we need to do differently because we don't have this coalition. Something isn't working along our side that we're not along. So really asking tough questions about ourselves, putting the mirror up and say, you know, there's a problematic history of white segregation. How am I complicit? What's my relationship? How am I actively working? I think we need to ask those questions constantly to ground ourselves in this movement and this struggle. As my friend and colleague, you know, Asif Wilson here talks about, how do we move in solidarity with families and communities? What questions do we need to ask to learn what other people are fighting for, and how do we join and support that? I think once we can start to ask some of those questions, right, we can start to see how this coalition emerges. And then also, you know, just challenging us, right, to how do we, and I struggle with this daily, to what's our commitment? How do we re-up the commitment? How do we take time for ourselves to keep part of these conversations, but sustain it? I've seen a lot of people like teacher burnout, right? It's the same thing with advocacy burnout. Just what are we doing to make sure to take care of ourselves and to take care of this potential coalition? You know, I really do. We can research and research, but if we're not taking care of ourselves and asking these deep questions about how we're forming our relationships as part of our work, right, we can't move forward. I don't know how that makes sense. It's the end of a long day.
Makes a lot of sense.
But
Yeah.
you're just trying to ask those tough questions.
Thank you.
Well, Jon, I cannot tell you how inspirational this evening has been for me. I am one of those tired advocates, and this has been inspiring. It's been encouraging. It's made me think about some new things and some new ways of saying things and pushing for things. We know that there are some positive things, like Heather said, that are out there. We still have a nation that love their teachers. love their schools. We still have parents and teachers still work hard together. We haven't broken them apart. We know there are a lot of people who still value public education. We know that even some of those folks who don't have kids, they, you know, there's a community commitment to the polls have shown that they don't like private schools being funded with tax dollars. There are some glimmers out there of messaging and things that we can do, and I greatly appreciate that, and I thank all of you for coming tonight. I think you saw for just a second there that we have a report. I want to go flip back one more time. This is an outstanding report that's on our website. We thought it would be very interesting to look at the private schools who are getting vouchers. And you know what's going on in those schools, because we know that there's a floodgate been opened, and what you'll find out is most of these schools are religious schools, and almost all of them discriminate on who they admit in their school or who they kick out of their school. And I mean, some of them, you know, parents have to be baptized and sign agreements to do certain things, and it's not, you know, almost all of the faith schools have different rules, whether they're Christian or not. So it's really interesting. I really hope you would look at it. It really discriminates against it's any child with a disability or special education need. Don't apply. It's almost very clear on some of their websites. So this is a very powerful report. Thank you, Heather, for doing it. And it's just one of the ways that we're trying to do. John, we are dedicated to doing what you've been saying. Friends, help us, right? Educate our public, engage our public, you know, educate our voters, make sure they understand what they're voting for and who they're voting for. And so we encourage you, and these are all the ways you can stay informed. Please look for us in all these spaces and like us and join us and all these kind of things to help support us, because that helps our donors feel good and that keeps our work going. And John, I am so thrilled that I had the honor of meeting you in person in DC, that I've read your book twice now. First, just to straight through for enjoyment. And then secondly, to highlight and underline and mark all the things I wanted to share with friends. And John, I am proud to tell you that I am going to release you to your 3 children 3 minutes early. John,
thank you so much. This has been fabulous.
3 little children waiting to see him. And so thanks everybody for joining us. This will be posted on YouTube in a few days. And Dr. Hale, I hope that we see each other again soon.
I hope so too. And thank you everyone so much for your time, your interest, and thank you for the conversation. You're doing inspiring work. I've been following you since I met you. So thank you for doing what you're doing. And please stay in touch. I'm here. So
we will. And y'all get his book, either if not through our book author, go on Amazon and get it, okay? Because it's worth quoting. Good night, Michael. Good night, Suzanne, all our friends. Bye-bye. Thank you, Heather. You did an outstanding job moderating, and both of you have left us with a lot to think about. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.